who watch this to be kind of freaking out. As you can see, a little different background. There's a little bit of different background. Not normally. I love that crucifix that kind of sits right behind me in that background. It's always a great one. So, all right, we just had opening prayer, and definitely we keep everybody in our parish community in our prayers. So today we do the second part of the sixth commandment, and I just want to give a shout out to our beloved Deacon Raymond, who was scheduled to do today. He will be doing next week's presentation, but Deacon is out and about doing the Catholic Charities campaign. So definitely keep Deacon in prayer, because, you know, he heads up Catholic Social Services, and, you know, our kids have been involved over the last 4 or 5 years in terms of volunteering there, doing some of the work. And, you know, the needs are great. Ain't that right, Anthony? The needs are always great, right? The needs are always great there. And so during even relatively good times, the need is great. You could imagine that even now, more so, the need is even greater. So we continue to pray for all those who head up the Catholic Social Services. But to me, one of the best parts about the Catholic Charities campaign is that Catholic Social Services dimension, because that really is the hands and feet of Christ. And if you talk to Deacon Raymond, he will tell you probably upwards of 90% minimum of the people that are served by Catholic Social Services are not even Catholic, which is big. I mean, I've seen it. The little bit that I've had the opportunity to be a part of, the little bit of what they do over there, I've seen, people. Our daughter worked there for a while too, and people who could not afford their medications, Catholic Social Services pays for their medications, and so that's a lot that goes on. So definitely want to pray for that. So Deacon, we salute you for being a part of what we do with the Archdiocese and Catholic Social Services. So he will be here next week. And Father Shribeth is coming back to town. He's been out. He's been on world tour. His father's ministry with the diocese is prison ministry. So Father has been directing the prison ministry for the Archdiocese for the last 2 years. But since March, prisons are on lockdown, no visits. So he has found himself looking for opportunities to serve and to do things. So he helps out with us he does, a significant number of the classes here. He loves doing that. I know that he does like a Saturday morning thing, Paul, right? Isn't that, he does, I think a class on theology of the body on Saturday mornings. He does at Our Lady of Guadalupe. He does a Bible study on Thursday nights. So he's keeping busy. And every now and then we see him at Mass. He does, and every Friday he's at Catholic doing Montgomery Catholic offering Mass. So he's staying busy.
What days is he coming and what is he doing?
Here, I got to see. Let's see where. Well, let's see. I got it right up here on the schedule. I got it right here. Father Shribeth will be back January 31st, and he runs through February 14th. So he does it 3 weeks in a row. You ever notice that with Father? He likes taking one right after the other. That's what he likes to do. So there you go. So, but his agent's tough. His agent is tough. Try to work with his agent and secure those contracts and deals and those endorsements.
He's on the list.
Who?
Father Stephen?
No. I'm just teasing about his agent. He's tough to negotiate with. No, but anyway, so he's doing good, and he'll be back 2 weeks from today. Okay, so the second part of the sixth commandment, we touch on the topic, the integrity of the person, which is the call of chastity. In fact, the second part of the sixth commandment, which the first part's dealing with the nuptial meaning of the body, stuff that we talked about last week, the male and the female. how there's an interconnectedness between the male and the female. The second part at 2337, so if you have your catechism, or if you want to go online, you can find it online, 2337, that begins with this topic, the vocation to chastity. What's the word vocation mean? Calling, right. It comes from the Latin vocatio, here the vocal, so it the call to chastity. And this is something that's always surprising to people, because if you ask the average high schooler, and this always trips them up, I, as a married man, am I called to chastity? Right? Screws them up all the time, because what does the culture think chastity means? Yeah, not having sex, right? Because we're all confused on this stuff, right? I mean, it's just, it truly is. I mean, we talk about a train wreck in the culture, but chastity does not mean celibacy, and it does not mean not having sex. Chastity comes from the Latin to chasten. So if you chasten somebody, what are you doing? Correcting, disciplining, okay? And again, that's another problem in our society. When we hear the word discipline, most of the time we think positive or negative. Negative. Is that true? No, right? Because discipline is about being formed, right? I love this. Everybody's a mentor. I've heard that said. Everybody's a mentor. The only question is, will you be a good one or a bad one? I think there's truth in that, right? So this is what it says, 2337. Chastity means the successful integration of sexuality within the person, and thus the inner unity of man in his bodily and spiritual being. Integration. I love that word. Integrity. What does integrity mean? What does integration mean? How many times have we heard the whole person? Right? We're dealing with the whole person. The word integrity basically means you are on the outside what you are on the inside, right? That's the goal, that you're a person of integrity. There's a wholeness to you. So chastity means the successful integration of sexuality within the person, and thus the inner unity of man in his bodily and spiritual being. Notice that. Is there a divide between the bodily and the spiritual here? No. In fact, some of the things that you guys are probably talking about with the theology of the body is touching on this integration between the spirit and the body, right? Have you guys gotten into that part yet? Right? Now, if you ask most people in the world, or even in the church, do they see an interconnectedness between the bodily dimension of the human person and the spiritual dimension? I think it's fair to say what Pope Benedict, the Emeritus Pope, said in 1958 when he was a young priest. He was 31. He'd probably been a priest about 3 years at this time. I think I mentioned it last week. That's the article that he wrote in which he said that he saw the church was going to become a small creative minority. Yeah. But he said that he was talking in the context of Nazism. As a German, he was talking as a German priest and saying, okay, what happened? Let's deconstruct this. And he called Nazism a neo-Gnostic pagan movement. A neo-Gnostic pagan movement. That's a mouthful, isn't it? What does Gnostic mean? What does that refer to? Somebody who's a Gnostic. Not Gnostic, Gnosis. Gnosis in Greek means knowledge. So we have the word diagnosis, gets it through knowledge or prognosis, right? Gnostic was the first heresy that the early church had to fight against. It was the denial of the bodily realm, that the physical realm could in any way be something good. So you had different groups of Gnostics, and I know that this is a severely truncated understanding, but for our purposes, it works. There were different types of Gnostics. So I just want to say that. The two main schools, and to my former student, Joey, who's on a radio show. Joey, I know I'm not being 100% technical right now. Joey's a radio host, 93.1. Hi, Joey. We love you. Proud of you. I taught you. So there you go. Joey's uncle. Does anybody know who Joey's uncle is? A certain Monsignor, the Vicar General. Hi, Monsignor Bill. How are you? We love you. Disclaimer, Monsignor and I, not everything, Joey, that you say on the radio do we say 100%, but we love that you're on that radio. So that's great. That we're very proud of you. But anyway, in the ancient world, like I said, there's all these different Gnostic ideas, but the two main ones that are dominant are Epicureanism and Stoicism. And I know that Epicurus was much more than what I'm about to present. But at the cash counter of it, Epicureanism is this idea that the body doesn't really have any value in the spiritual life. And so if you indulge it, there's no problem. If you indulge the body and what the body wants, there's no problem. Now, Epicurus does not advocate that you do that. But for Epicurus, there's no problem with doing that, indulging the body. It's not going to make you grow in the spirit realm at all. So whatever you do with the body, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. Whereas the Stoics, as the name suggests, the body has these interests and desires. So we know that word stoic, right? A stoic is somebody who say they don't really have a facial expression. So you deny the bodily passion, okay? Because the body's bad. So the Epicurus approach is basically body bad, doesn't matter what you do with it. You can indulge it or not indulge it. Stoics, body bad, starve it, deprive it. But what they both affirm is that there's no integration between the body and the soul or body and the spirit. Does that make sense? I would argue Pope Benedict, when he was Father Ratzinger, is 100% correct. We are living in a neo-Gnostic world where you will have people who don't think twice about, oh, I'm not religious, but I am, what do you hear people say? I am spiritual. I don't do churchianity. All you Catholics are doing churchianity right now with your whatever, right? Fill in the blank. I'm spiritual. Yes, Anthony, go ahead. Right. That doesn't make any sense. Not certainly from an authentic Orthodox Christian perspective, right? Because the Christian perspective has always been body and soul together, okay? And so you have these various Gnostic groups that always rear their head in history. You know, even though the early church was able to defeat Gnosticism in the early centuries of the church, think about the Nicene Creed, right? He is consubstantial with who? The Father. So he's of the same essence or nature as the Father. But for our sake and for our salvation, he became man, right? That was a big claim back then, okay? And so some, you know, the early Valentinus and all these different heretical groups, they would have denied that. So the Catechism is saying, no, the bodily and spiritual reality need to be integrated into a whole. So we are a body-soul reality. That's one of the problems when it comes to the larger culture. Do people really think we have a soul? And if you really have a soul, how do you develop it, right? Most people don't know how to do that, right? Because they don't have a formation in the soul. Sexuality, in which man's belonging to the bodily and biological world is expressed, becomes personal and truly human when it is integrated into the relationship of one person to another in the complete and lifelong mutual gift of man and woman. So when does our sexuality most fully express itself? When it unites itself to another, right? In this mutual self-giving, right? What?
You were asking a rhetorical question, but I was going to say 12.
But pointing out, the fact that I have an almost 13-year-old girl, and we talk about all these things of growing up, it's so helpful to be able to say, God made us this way. God made you this way. And yes, it feels awkward and weird and gross and whatever you may be experiencing. It's so helpful to say, this is God's design. This is how God made us. And this is our biological self as God designed us. And I think that's a very comforting thing to remember in the throes of growing up.
It is comforting. I wish I'd have heard it before now.
Well, I felt like a monster. I was a child that grew up really early. I was an early bloomer, and it was difficult. I mean, I remember asking God in my prayer as a little girl to make me like all my other friends. Why was I so tall and different? And so I think our children really need that message.
Well, it was all horrible.
To say that this was in God's design. God made you this way, and it's a beautiful, wonderful thing, although difficult and you feel uncomfortable, and that's normal and fine, but that all the things that are happening with your body is in God's design, and for us to understand it through God's lens and not the cultural lens.
Right, exactly. That's the key thing, is that we need to have, that's another thing, and Katie, I'm glad you mentioned that, because even, as you got people out there raising kids, or, let's say we have grandchildren, someone's teaching them about sex. The question is who? But the idea, so you want, their peers teaching them? I don't think so, right? But for most kids, I mean, sometimes our former president, Ann Caesar, and I used to talk about this all the time. If you'd ask her, what would she have loved to have seen, especially if you could just do one thing that the kids could not have access to, it would be these things. And yet, gosh, I think probably from third grade up, almost everybody's got one. And you think, why does a 9-year-old honestly need a smartphone with internet capability? It's one thing if they had a smartphone, and this is the other thing, people feel helpless in this, but you can get your child a smartphone that is only a phone and can only message the parents. I know, because that's what we got. Much to the chagrin of some young people, you don't want the kids having access to the internet at all times. You just don't. And that's what happens when you give them the smartphone with no restrictions whatsoever. But that's the problem, is that they can go check out things. They can, any video under the sun, right? They can see it, especially if there's no filter on it. And that's what winds up happening. Kids get themselves exposed to things that they shouldn't get themselves exposed to. And so the culture, rather than the church, winds up forming our kids. And even if we're trying to form our kids, the cacophony of noise out there can really set them off on the wrong path. So we recognize the integration of the body and the soul. I love this. The virtue of chastity, therefore, involves the integrity of the person and the integrality of the gift. So making a gift of self. When you think of marriage, or even in terms of your life, even if, say, not in marriage, what is the greatest gift that you and I can give? $1 million check, right? The self, right? Yeah, love. And the definition of love is to make a gift of yourself for the good of the other, right? To make a gift of yourself for the good of the other. So Now, the integrity of the person. The chaste person maintains the integrity of the powers of life and love placed in him. This integrity ensures the unity of a person. It is opposed to any behavior that would impair it. It tolerates neither a double life nor duplicity in speech. Remember what I said before about integrity? What you are on the outside, you are on the inside, right? There's a connectedness, there's an interrelatedness between those two things. Notice what it says there. It tolerates neither a double life nor duplicity in speech. I remember once hearing, actually, Scott Hahn's former professor, when Scott Hahn was a Presbyterian, this man's name was John Gershner. And Gershner used to say, young man, you know how sometimes you'll ask a question and you say, teacher might answer it, or you talk, well, that's not what I meant. That's not what I meant. And then, like, you want to get a redo at the question or something. And Gershner is famous for always saying, young man, you're going to have to learn to say what you mean and mean what you say. And he moved on. He wouldn't answer the question. Moved on. Learn, right? Duplicity in speech. Say what you mean what you say. What does the Bible say? Let your yes be yes, and your no be no, right? You know, right? Exactly. Less is more. Duplicity. Being straightforward. Speech should be, as St. Paul says, sprinkled with salt, if you will. It tolerates neither a double life nor duplicity in speech, right? No hypocrisy. Say what you mean what you say, live out what you mean, right? Briefly, yes.
I'll just add before we move on to the point of the gift. What makes the beauty of the priesthood what it is that gift of chastity he gives back to Christ and the church, which so many other, denominations of the faith do not recognize, of course, because their ministers, et cetera, are married. And the Lutheran, of course, they're allowed to be married. Anglican, same thing. But so that beauty of giving that a man deciding to give himself back as a gift, is giving that chastity back to God, to me makes the beauty of the priesthood that much more meaningful.
Right. That's why both the vocation to the priesthood, holy orders, and marriage are both sacraments that are interconnected with each other, both sacraments at the service of communion, right? Because they both have in view the making of gift of self for the communion, right? There. So there you go, right? We mentioned about the integrity of the body and the spiritual, as it talked about so far in this section. It uses this language of the powers of life and love placed in him, right? It maintains the integrity of the powers of life and love placed in him, right? We have the powers of the body, right? Certain things that are true of the body, right? When we spend a lot of time in education, we take anatomy classes, we take biology classes, right? We study the body, how the body works, reproductive system, all of those things, nutrition, right? What about the powers of the soul? What are the powers of the soul? You've heard Father Sheba talk about imagination and the intellect and the will, right? Traditionally understood following Aristotle, though there's some, there's some people will say there's 4 powers of the soul. Some will say there's 3 powers of the soul, but it depends upon how they define them. The long and short of it, there's 3 basic properties or powers of the soul: passions, intellect, and will. Now, under the passions, we talk about the various appetites, as Aquinas winds up explaining that. Irascible appetites, irascible appetites. It's very, in my opinion, very confusing. Don't tell anybody I just said that Aquinas gets confusing, but just between us, okay? But the thing is that for the basic idea, the passions, the intellect, and the will, right, the properties of the soul. And so the soul and the body communicate, right? And so you think of it in terms of this way. This is why we have to form the soul, right? Because the baby, think of the baby. Is the baby able to express their hunger in an intellectual way? No. Is the baby able to express hunger, though? Yes, has to, or the baby will die. right? Because the baby cannot intellectually express, hey, mom, it's feeding time. Can't do that. You know, the baby does not have control yet of the will. This is why we talk about the age of reason. You know, this language of age of reason is not arbitrary. When Pius X changed communion, it wasn't like they were going eeny, meeny, miny, mo, let's make second grade. The consensus of theologians around the world at that time was, when do we see people being able to exercise a genuine choice? Okay. And they kind of eyeballed it out and said, it depends. It seems about the age of 7 or 8 seems to be a time where we could actually have meaningful conversations, obviously fully recognized. Now, the whole reason why, because at that point, communion was received usually around 13 or 14. What you see, the irony is, it used to be confirmation would be about 7 or 8, and communion would be about 13 or 14, because in the order, it's baptism, confirmation, communion. So what Pius wanted to do is he didn't change the confirmation age, but what he wanted to do is he wanted to bring communion age down. So the reason why we have in second grade is Pius X. He wanted to encourage more frequent communion so that people would receive communion more frequently. But the age of reason number, which the church doesn't define as a particular number, it's just kind of vague, right? Some people, it might be slightly younger. Others, it might be slightly later. You know, you got to kind of eyeball it up, right? But that number, the key thing is that number is not random. It's not arbitrary. It's thought through. Most of the world, on the other hand, with all due respect, a lot of it is, as George Weigel might say, full contact karate. We just kind of make a shot in the dark, and if it hits, it hits. Have you ever listened to debates in the public realm? Most of our politicians could not, listen, without them being handled, I don't care if it's a Republican or a Democrat. Most of our politicians in here could not do what I'm doing right now. They couldn't. But they get the title on the honorable. They're not. Most of them are hacks. Now, some of them are good. Some of them are good. Some of them can think their way out of a paper bag, but most of them couldn't.
No, they can't.
My wife's getting mad at me back there. She's like, stop. What are you going on? But I say all that. The reason why I say that is not to take gratuitous cheap shots at politicians. It's because our formation in our culture is terrible. We don't have a formation in the soul. We don't have a training in the soul. What are the properties of the soul? Even if you get people who acknowledge that we have a soul. I had a situation 9 years ago, 2011. In fact, no, it was not. It would not have been. Daniel's class would have been. Daniel graduated in 14, so Daniel's freshman year was 10. This student, freshman, was 2011, graduated in 15. So anyway, long story short, if you go to a private school and let's say you have a verification of need, okay, but the private school does not offer that need, okay, for whatever reason, you have access through the public system to get certain things that you might need, okay, certain helps that they could provide. You have that right, okay, even if you go to a private school. So you get kind of tested or observed. So one day I had the privilege of having somebody who represented the Montgomery public school system sitting in my class. This was quite enjoyable for me. I was told by at the time, the principal, Fran, she said, Tom, you're going to have a guest today. The student doesn't know who this guest is. They just think it's somebody in the kids won't think of it. But she's going to be observing one of the students in the class, and I knew who the student was that she would be observing, just to see how they were acting in the class as far as their attention and all that kind of stuff, like what kind of help that the student would need as far as moving forward. Okay. So anyway, long story short, she sat in the back of the room. She sat in the last desk over by the windows. I still remember it. It was morality class. So I purposely tailored my class to be as generic as possible and not be, particular on, say the Sermon on the Mount or the Bible says, though of course that's part of the class. A lot of the morality section, we deal with things like, for example, tomorrow is Martin Luther King Day, right? We read a letter from a Birmingham jail, natural law, things like that. At the end of the class, she came up to me and she said, and I say this is the first time I'm ever saying this. I've shared this story in school, but no public way. She said, I wish that our students could have taught to them what you just taught these kids. I did not waste 1 second, and I looked at her and I said, with all due respect, other than beginning this class in prayer, which we did, everything I talked about, I could go to Lamp tomorrow and teach, and no one can say that I was being sectarian when it came to religion. But they don't.
That you were being what?
Sectarian, like that I was being like, there was nothing, everything was human. Everything was human. Everything was about being human. What does it mean to be human? But our children are being deprived that education. An education in which they learn what it means to be fully human. Because if you are body and soul, and your education is only in the body, you have a malformed education, right? So how can you be integral, right? You can't be. That's the problem. And that's why it's talking about, and listen to this language in the next paragraph. Chastity includes an apprenticeship in self-mastery, which is training in human freedom. If we went and we did a man or woman on the street, you know how they do those man and woman? And if we went to, say, East Chase or somewhere out there, just kind of ran, and we asked people what's freedom, what would most people say human freedom is? Doing whatever you want, right? Something along those lines, right? The right to self-determination, okay? Would anybody come up with the definition self-mastery, which is training in human freedom? If they did, you go, oh, you just came from Paul's catechism class. Right? The alternatives, listen to this. The alternative is clear. So if we don't have this apprenticeship in self-mastery, which is training in human freedom, the alternative is clear. Either we govern ourselves by our passions and find peace, or he lets himself be dominated by the passions and becomes unhappy. Right? So either we will govern our passions, either we will be self-mastering our passions and find some kind of peace, or we will become dominated by the passions and become unhappy. So think of it this way: chastity. Think what I said before about, Steve, is discipline, right? We chasten the passions, right? So think of the passions, intellect, and the will. So in order for us to live a chaste life, we have to discipline or chasten the passions. Think about the child. The child cannot say, Mom, I'm hungry. The child cries, right? Because the child feels the sensation. The child cannot describe hunger, but the child feels it, right? And that's a good thing, right? Because that helps, right? That helps. That helps you discover something's wrong. As C.S. Lewis famously said, right? Pain is God's microphone, right? It's a good thing that we feel pain, all right? If we didn't, we could get ourselves in a big problem. Oh my gosh, my hand is burning. You have no idea, right? And that does happen sometimes. People lose the feeling, right? So you get the idea, right? So the passions, these appetites, as Aquinas would call them, those are the first things to develop. They're right out of the gate. But over time, what happens? As the child develops, the use of reason that they're already born with. It's not like one day we got the ability to reason, right? Like all of it. It's there. But it's latent. Just like a child who has the ability, who becomes a baseball player and can hit the ball 500 feet, right? They didn't wake up one day and all of a sudden, okay, now all of a sudden I got this power. It's there. It's being developed. So we have the use of reason. We have reason when we're born. We don't have its use. Does that make sense? But be careful, right? So right. The Latin word potentia, potential, a power, right? We use the word potential. As a Mets fan growing up, Darryl Strawberry, he had the potential to be the next Ted Williams, they said. Well, he had a great career, but he did not reach his potential, right? So, wow, I can still remember some home runs that he hit. Amazing. So,
Let me throw something to you. You're talking to a secular teacher, and commandments come up. If you say holy commandments, that puts religion into the secular world. If Paul says it's a holy commandment in Romans, well, you already crossed over into religion. So how does the public school stand the perimeter on that and say, we let you squeak in a little bit of commandment,
right.
but you can't say God had anything to do. You can talk about law in public school all day, but you can't put the origin or the creator of that in place. Is
right.
that correct? How would you deal with a teacher in your class?
If I was at a public school or a like a non-Catholic school, right, or whatever, so let's say just any school setting, I would still be able to talk. I would talk about things like natural law, which are things that are common to humanity, at the very least, to be able to get that conversation going, which is what I did when that representative from the Montgomery Public School System was in my class. I talked about things that would be common to being human. Okay. If you've ever read the letter from a Birmingham jail, Dr. King talks about natural law. The problem with natural law is we only bring it out if you affirm a natural law worldview, you will be attacked for smuggling God in the back door. Robert Bork, the Bork confirmation hearings, which, he did not make it. Bork got borked. In fact, and I do think that this is true. It's always happened. The day the American political system died, in many ways, the hatred and vitriol that we see today began with the late Senator Ted Kennedy proudly borking Bork, because that's when the gloves were taken off. And I mean, Antonin Scalia won 100% of the vote. Would you ever see that happening today? Okay. That was Scalia, So anyway, but he got attacked for the natural law position that he held. They said he was smuggling God in the back door. You remember that, Paul? All right.
Clinton got his nominees through in the 90s.
Yeah, he did. That's fair. You're right.
Thomas was close.
Yeah, Thomas was close.
Bush was president. He went back to the close one, but even Clinton got
Yeah, he did. And I think Sotomayor got like 88 votes or something like that. See, she was about 80. Yeah, and certainly better than the three, the three we've had recently. But anyway, natural law is something that's common to all humans. But after the situation with the Nazis, the issue became, how do we prosecute these people? And it was a real issue. The problem that you ran into is, if we write laws that say, okay, you are now on trial for these crimes, well, that's ex post facto. That's after the fact. You can't do that, because the crimes, as Dr. King points out in his letter from a Birmingham jail, what doesn't culture ever like to remember about what Adolf Hitler did in Germany? was all legal. I have two friends that went to law school, and I have other people that are lawyer. But one friend, Mary Angela, who went to law school, and then somebody else that I know who went to law school. One I think went to Yale Law School. The other, she went to Notre Dame Law School. She said the most depressing thing about law school was they never really learned about what the law is. It was always about how to use the law, how to argue the law, how to manipulate the law, but never really actually get into what is the law, what is the purpose of this thing we call the law, right? It was basically how we can manipulate it. That's called legal positivism. It's basically whatever's right is what the law says it is. So after you had the Holocaust, people just kind of knew this wasn't right. We got to do something about this. So how do we prosecute these people? Well, we can't come in after the fact and say this is illegal because their laws said they were fine. Well, do we take our laws? Do we take U.S. law or whatever? Well, whose law do we take? The Soviets? Whose law do we take? The French? Whose law do we take and say, well, our laws say, well, do you really want another country to come in and say, well, this violates our law, so we're going to prosecute by our laws? How many of you want to get prosecuted by the laws that were on the books in North Korea? Right? If North Korea became the power, and right, you wouldn't, right? So what do? Well, Supreme Court Justice Jackson, who kind of led the charge at Nuremberg. Well, I'm going to go up in the attic and I'm going to pull out natural law. That there are just certain things that we know that we cannot not know. And that's called the natural law. And that's a law that is true regardless of where you're from, your ethnic group and background, right? And so they dusted it off, even though it had already begun to die in most of the political world of the day. But when they were up against the wall, they had to bring it out. And then, of course, after Nuremberg, they put it back in and everybody forgets about it. And, we have our abortion laws and things like that in various states. Because the worst kept secret about Roe v. Wade was abortion already on the books before. Yeah, right. Worst kept secret. I mean, it was already there. All that did was somehow make it a federal issue. But by and large, if abortion was overturned tomorrow at the Roe v. Wade level, you'd still have half the states in the country that would have it. Now, I'm not saying that's not something to fight for. I'm just saying that that's the reality. But then Martin Luther King, the civil rights movement, same principles were in play. The letter from a Birmingham jail is an absolute must read for people, because when Dr. King is trying to make an argument for what they ask him, well, why do you object to these laws? You talk about keeping these laws over here. And he goes, that's a good question. I'm glad you asked. And then he talks about just law and unjust law. And he actually provides a definition that goes beyond my personal likes or dislikes. He says, a just law is any law that affirms the natural, eternal, moral law of God, and it affirms and uplifts the human person. An unjust law is any law that goes against the natural, moral law as revealed by God, and an unjust law strips the human person of their dignity as a human being. It treats a human person as a thing and not a subject, a he or a she, rather an it. Okay? And so anytime a human person is reduced to that of an it, the human person becomes a commodity. Okay?
It'd be canceled today, Tom.
Oh, absolutely. Let me quote the great Archbishop Rhodey.
We know the color of your skin matters these days.
What?
We're already in the tribal mentality right now. And in 1984, it's talked about in the book in 1984.
Right.
George Orwell, the cancel culture, they even use the term. So he would be a ostracized, conservative black man right now by the powers to be.
Right. If you actually pay attention to how Martin Luther King Jr. is described, as Archbishop Rhodey points out, what is almost always universally neglected when they talk about Martin Luther King Jr.?
Universally neglected?
Oh.
That he's an African American?
That he was a preacher.
Oh, preacher.
He's a social activist. He's fighting for social justice. He's a civil rights leader. But the fact that he is a preacher, as Archbishop Brody points out, is almost always neglected. What dominates the landscape in talking about Martin Luther King Jr.? I Have a Dream or a letter from a Birmingham jail? You do not have I Have a Dream without a letter from a Birmingham jail. If you want to know who Martin Luther King Jr. was, you need to read a letter from Birmingham jail. And hardly anybody has, because it's in that letter that he would get himself in trouble today. But he's writing this letter from a jail, and he's talking about things that he just assumes that people he's talking to know. He's quoting Aquinas, Augustine. To quote St. Augustine, could you imagine a public document like that today where Aquinas and Augustine make like 6 appearances in the document? In a public realm situation? I can't even imagine that, right? Heck, try to find a church leader to quote Aquinas today. Ain't that right, Paul? Yeah. But anyway, that's the thing, right? A formation in the soul, the powers of the soul, the intellect, reason. How do we make a decision, right? And so the intellect has to, if you will, and by intellect, we don't mean the ACT or SAT score. By the intellect, we mean a moral formation, controls the passions, so that when the will makes a decision, it makes an informed choice. And if you don't have that moral formation, what's going to make the decision for you? The passions, right? If it feels good, do it. But if it feels good and just go off and do it, why do I feel so sad, as one song said some years ago? Sheryl Crow. I remember that song.
You can't be with the one you love the one you love.
Right? So this importance of controlling the passions. Human dignity, therefore, requires the man and the woman to act out of a conscious and free choice, as moved and drawn in a personal way from within, and not by blind impulses in himself or mere external constraint. Think about it this way. Can we merely impose our will on others to get them to do what we want? We could do it, but as I think it was Franklin who said, a mind changed against its will is of the same opinion still. A mind changed against its will is of the same opinion still. Right? Man's dignity, therefore, requires him to act out of a conscious and free choice, right? That's authentic human freedom, as moved and drawn in a personal way, kind of like with Father Youngman, if you went to the 8 o'clock Mass, his homily today, the personal call, right? And not by blind impulses in himself or by mere external constraint. So we just can't make a law to change people, though it's tempting, right? The law should reflect and affirm what Dr. King is as a just law and unjust law, right? Problems that we see in the political realm comes from the fact that we've lost the culture and not the other way around. We think that, the political realm is going to be where the battle is drawn. As a friend of mine, some of you know, Baron Coleman. Baron, has said that, and I think rightfully so, when you think of a Supreme Court justice being nominated, people are fighting to the walls on that issue. The real response constitutionally should be yawn. But Not in our world, because the Supreme Court justice is, if you remember the game Pac-Man, when Pac-Man would eat his energy, it gets really big, right? That's what the Supreme Court judge is now today. He's Pac-Man on steroids. He shouldn't be, or she shouldn't be. We shouldn't really care much about the Supreme Court. Shouldn't have to. But they become a super legislator. Why? Because most people in our legislatures only care about getting reelected. Therefore, they don't want to legislate. And we accept that they can write 60, whatever, how many pages bills, 6,000 page bills, or in some cases, 15,000 page bills. We actually, with a straight face, will accept the fact that the United States Congress, in a period of about a week, wrote legislation that was about 6,000 pages long. That's a joke. It's impossible. It's not possible. So who wrote it? They didn't write it. And they're going to vote on it. And we accept that. We accept that. We accept that because most in our culture have not had a moral formation. And that goes for, there was a federal judge after the marriage decision, and in terms with Obergefell. All right, my friend David Anders, who works up at EWTN, said the most tragic situation with the whole marriage debate was that the only side that ever used a moral argument were those who wanted to change the definition of marriage. And they would use language like fairness and tolerance, which is basically using moral language. The best our side could come up with was constitutionality. That's the best we could come up with. Well, the Constitution doesn't seem to talk about marriage. That's the best you can come up with. You're going to lose 100 times out of 100, right? And that's the problem that you run into, is we've lost the ability to make moral arguments, or at least principled moral arguments, because we're just kind of, going along with the flow. Right? You think in terms of, okay, if you're in Canada today and you say that marriage is between a man and a woman, how many of you are familiar, like, for example, in British Columbia, could you get fined for that? The answer is yes. You can get fined for it. And you run into a problem, right? Yet you're affirming. You could not affirm most of what's being said here in a public forum in Canada. But now, you're not going to go to jail, at least not yet, but you can get fined. They could make it where it's a problem for you. It's a nuisance, right? And so we need to have a formation in the moral life. This is what this is saying. We gain dignity. What is this? Man gains dignity when, ridding himself of all slavery to the passions, he can press forward to the goal by freely choosing what is good, and by diligence and skill effectively secures for himself the means suited to this end. I love that. The slavery of the passions. Who is truly free? The one who's enslaved to the passions, or the one who has self-mastery? Who is truly free?
Tom, when the Lord says to the guy asking how do I enter into life? I think that's, how do I enter into life? He says, keep the commandments. But keeping the commandments is not just the negative, don't do.
Right.
We leave out that whole portion of what we should be doing.
Right.
It just, the whole weight, just like we're talking about 6 commandments, if you talk to an elementary school, basically, understand you don't do this. But they don't understand the value of the love of doing what is right.
Right.
Why do we have the commandments? Because he so loved us. He don't want the human race to be destroyed internally with strife.
Right. Which is when we talked about adultery last week. I mean, the whole idea of adultery is God is a faithful God. He's not an adulterous God. He's not a fickle God, right? He's a covenant keeping God. Therefore, if we're going to properly image God in the world, we too need to be a people of fidelity, right? That's why it's important for us to understand that it's not just what we don't do, it's what we need to be doing, right? Exactly. Listen to this. We're getting ready to wrap this up. Whoever wants to remain faithful to their baptismal promises and resist temptation will want to adopt the means for doing so. What are the means for doing so? Number one is a self-knowledge. Does anybody know what St. Catherine of Siena said was the number one thing that you and I needed to do to grow in the spiritual life? Drum roll. Pray 5 rosaries a day. Nope. Go to a Mark Karam concert. Maybe. Mark will. I'm going to text Mark and say I mentioned him today, and he is going to be so happy. Go to daily mass. Nope. St. Catherine of Siena said that the number one thing that we need to do in order to grow in the spiritual life is we need to know who we are. Now, of course, she would agree with all those things, pray rosaries, absolutely, and going to mass, of course. But the first step, she said, is you have to know who you are.
A sinner. You got to start with that.
Yes, including that, right. And also your inclinations. We're all tempted, but we're not all tempted by the same things. Do we know ourselves, or do we just kind of go along for the ride? Because if the passions are dominating us, then really all we are is going along for the ride. Anthony?
Sounds like you're saying that we all have to be whole before we can actually be united with Christ. We must be a whole person. We can't have holes in our life.
Right. Well, it's both and, right? We're united to Christ, therefore we are being made whole, right? St. Paul tells us this in Ephesians, right? That his desire is to present us without spot or wrinkle. That's his calling, to present us. In fact, that is the calling of the priest. Just as the bishop has the calling in the diocese to see to it that he is leading the people into holiness, the pastor has a special responsibility canonically to lead you into holiness, to lead you to be members of the kingdom of heaven. In fact, one of the judgments on the pastor is going to be, what did he do or not do in leading you and me into becoming holier people? So it's a very serious call to lead a parish community, because you have that responsibility. You will play a role in that. In fact, I know one priest who actually in his first homily in the parish, at a parish, said, I did not get sent here to be your friend. I got sent here to get you to heaven. And one of my judgments will be, did I help you toward that end? So no, I'm not going to risk hell for you and not be faithful to the teaching.
What do you think when the Lord says, I didn't call the righteous, but I call the sinners? I came in the world for people like me, I didn't come in the world for everybody that's straight up and down, all that integrity stuff. He came in the world for people like me. Don't have all that integrity stuff.
Right.
I'm sorry.
No.
Off the mountain.
No. But it's important, right? We always have to keep that in mind. And then it winds up talking a little bit about the cardinal virtues. Like, for example, take a public school setting, right? Why can't they teach the cardinal virtues as part of their education? Archbishop Brody says that the danger that we've embraced, and I don't know exactly when this started, but it, when in doubt in education, blame Dewey. Archbishop Brody says the most dangerous thing in education is the myth of value neutral education. He says that's where people really bought the lie, that that we can present education in a kind of value neutral way. And the Archbishop says, but that itself is an actual value, and people don't recognize that. But it goes on. We'll wrap on this, but it goes on to talk about the cardinal virtues, the 4 cardinal virtues. It talks about temperance here. Learning how to use temperance, right, to control the passions. But that, is going to be part of any authentic educational system. So the vocation to chastity, our calling to be a people of an integrated whole, body and soul. Oh, all right. We'll wrap up in prayer. It's already 10:35. Some of you have to go to the 11 o'clock mass, so we'll definitely pray. Next week, Deacon Raymond will finish up the 3rd part of the 6th commandment. And also next week, I just want to make this announcement just as a reminder. Next Sunday at 2:30 at Greenwood Serenity Memorial Gardens, we will have the 34th annual memorial service for the unborn. Our keynote speaker will be Bob Parker, and some of you may know that Bob is the owner of Dreamland Barbecue here in town. He will be the keynote speaker. So the 34th annual memorial service for the unborn, as we gather together outdoors, and obviously social distancing protocols will be in place as part of what I'm reading here, so that that we will acknowledge that. And various members of the community, as you know, were part of. This is what I'm reading, what John said. It's in remembrance of 18 unnamed babies found many years ago near the Montgomery Mall dumpster who died as a result of abortion, and various local clergy and members of Alabama Citizens for Life were able to recover those babies and give them a proper burial at Greenwood Cemetery. For those of you who are new to our community, that is what this is about. So it's also a remembrance of those who died, and also for reclaiming, as John Paul II said, a culture of life and love. So if you have the opportunity to attend next week, next Sunday, 2:30, Greenwood Cemetery, for the prayer and gathering together. So, all right, we'll close in prayer in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. All right. There we go. There we go. End the stream.